Hello everyone and welcome to At America TV. My name is James, one of the e-guides here at America, and we welcome audience members joining us today. At America is the United States Embassy's American Center, and our mission is to provide a space for young Indonesians to learn more about the United States. In this episode, we will be having Convergence journalism in the US media landscape. But before we begin, let's break the ice with a little game. I have here a question for everybody. How many awards in journalism were specified in Joseph Pulitzer's will? Is it 4, 6, 8, or 10? Stay tuned until the end of this program because we'll be giving a live shout out to whoever can answer correctly on our social medias. And now, for those of you in Zoom, the translation feature has been activated for this event. This feature allows you to choose which language you would like to hear, English or Bahasa Indonesia. To activate this feature, you have to click the button at the bottom right of your Zoom panel. Other than that, don't forget to take a selfie and tag at America's Instagram account. And now, we have a video remark from Pak Nicholas Geisinger, Deputy Press Attaché from the US Embassy Jakarta. Check this out.
Hello everyone, selamat malam Indonesia, dan selamat pagi Amerika. Good evening Indonesia, good morning USA, and welcome to this virtual discussion on journalism and media convergence in the United States. Thank you all for tuning in. My name is Nick Geisinger, and I am the Deputy Press Attaché of the U.S. Embassy in Jakarta. The U.S. Embassy is very happy to be able to host this discussion and provide the space for you to learn about and discuss issues that matter for both of our countries. In today's digital age, journalism and media convergence is becoming more and more relevant, and mobility restrictions during the COVID-19 pandemic have made that even more true. Convergence journalism, as you know and we'll learn more about tonight, means bringing together multiple forms of media to tell more effective stories. Now, what does that mean for the reporter who might have previously only gathered information for a story? Is that reporter now taking pictures and recording audio and video for many platforms? What does it mean for the future of traditional media and traditional journalists? To help us sort through these issues, we're joined tonight by two experts who will share their knowledge and views from the United States and Indonesia. So thank you very much to our moderator, Dr. Camelia, and our speaker, Michael, for joining us this evening. Throughout all the changes we're experiencing, media is going to remain an important pillar for our countries. As two great and diverse democracies, we rely on quality journalism to inform our citizens, to fulfill their need and their right to current and accurate information. While technology allows information to be presented in many forms, and those forms will continue to change, one thing's for sure, whether you're working as a journalist or you're an aspiring journalist or just someone who's passionate about journalism, your role is important to the continued strength of our country's democracies. So tonight and beyond, I encourage you to exchange thoughts on this issue and how it applies to Indonesia and how we can learn from each other, and to share ideas with those who are not here tonight. So thank you once again to our audience for your enthusiasm and for participating in tonight's discussion. And thanks again to Dr. Camelia and Michael. I look forward to a great discussion and all the positive echoes that I expect will come from it. Thank you. Terima kasih.
What a great remark from Pak Geisinger. And now, without further ado, let me introduce everyone to our moderator for today, Dr. Camelia Pansandaran, dosen Prodi Jurnalistik dan Program Pasca Sarjana Komunikasi Universitas Multimedia Nusantara. Dr. Camelia, the stage is yours.
Thank you. Hello, good evening, everyone. Good morning, Michael. My name is Camelia. I'm journalism lecturer with Universitas Multimedia Nusantara. I'll be your moderator for tonight's discussion about media convergence in America. We will shortly hear and discuss about media convergence, but first let me introduce you to Michael O'Connell. Michael is a field editor with Patch in Northern Virginia. He is also the host and producer of the weekly It's All Journalism podcast and produces the Better News podcast for the American Press Institute. Previously, Michael was a digital editor at Local News Now, a senior digital editor at Federal News Network, a producer of the National Governors Association's Meet the Thread podcast, and managing editor at the Connection newspaper. For 3 years, Michael taught podcasting in the American University School of Communications Masters in Digital Storytelling program. Michael is also the author of textbook Turn Up the Volume, a down and dirty guide to podcasting. In tonight's session, Michael will share about U.S. media, how the technology advancements lead to media convergence in the U.S., the changing format of the media, and how it is perceived as disruption in the media industry, as well as the control of the content. Without further ado, let's start this session by listening to Michael's presentation. Michael, time is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen here. And open up my presentation. Hold on. So, actually, that's not where I wanted to be. That's the end. So, give me a second. So you get to see everything run backwards. My name is Michael O'Connell. I'm a journalist by trade, but also a podcaster. It's something that, a skill that I picked up that is very useful in this new environment where American journalism has been disrupted, has been changed by digital technology. And I kind of want to explain what that means to the day-to-day job of a journalist. My podcast, It's All Journalism, every week we interview working journalists about how they do their jobs, and we discuss many skills, video editing, audio editing, things like that may not have been part of a journalist's job just 10 years ago. So to sort of give all of our discussion into context, I wanted to go over a few points. So, what is convergence journalism? It comes down to I guess 3 C's. One of which is computing, communication, and content. So let's talk about the first one. So I'm going to use my podcast as an example. So computing, that's just very basic. It's the digital technology. How that connects with a podcast like ours. Our podcast, this is something we produce and create as an audio file, and it lives online on the internet so that people are able to access it. So that's just really kind of very basic. And it's sort of at the heart of how things have changed. And part of that comes down to the second part, the communication aspect of it. Our podcast, people listen to it on their cell phones, laptops, or tablets. So because it's a piece of digital technology, there are different ways to access it, and in different places. You don't have to go to a theater. You don't have to go turn on your television. You're not bound. You can listen to the podcast any time of the day, and that's true of digital video or online websites. It's very mobile. And then content. How did digital technology change content? Well, obviously, we're creating content that can be consumed, on your phones and on your laptops. So it's something that can take advantage of the strengths of those platforms. You can, in the past where you were maybe writing stories for print publication and maybe taking some photos and creating this static document, that's how people would consume the news. Now you have thanks to the technology, the platform you're on, and the content, content that you can create can take advantage of all of the things that you're able to do online, such as audio and video and data presentations. So a podcast like ours, it was made up of interviews and other pieces of audio that we put together to load up online. But there's another fourth C that people don't always think about, and I think this is kind of one of the things that's really important in understanding how digital technology has changed journalism. It used to be that daily newspapers, TV news programs, they were broadcasting at their audience. They were the ones who went and gathered the news, and then they pushed it out. So with digital technology, though, because the platform is open 24 hours a day, people can consume audio 24 hours a day. And so you don't have to have this sort of appointment viewing for the news website, or you don't have the limitations of like a daily newspaper where you have a deadline where you have to stop reporting and you have to publish and you've got to wait some time. It's a 24/7 news cycle, and that is a huge impact on the way newsrooms function and how our stories are put out. But the funny thing is even though we do the reporting and create this content online, ultimately the way that content is consumed is not our choice. So who is in control of our content ultimately? You are. And this was really kind of a thing that I think a lot of people don't reckon with when they are thinking about digital media and they're thinking about journalism. They think that reporters are going out there and they're going to bring back this content and they're in control of it. They're in control of the content they're creating and when they post it online. But once it leaves, it's really down to the consumer as to how they want to, how and when and if they can consume that content. So rather than having a news program at 6 p.m., we post something online in the middle of the day, and people can access it 24 hours a day. They can access it weeks later, or they could just not listen to it or not view it. It's their kind of choice. So journalists have sort of given up that ability to sort of set times and for consumption, and it's a very actually powerful change. Because it really comes down to raising the importance of creating content that is going to engage people and inspire them to come and read your content. Because otherwise, it won't get noticed because you're competing with so many other different types of content online. So that's caused a major disruption in a lot of ways. So convergence is all about disruption in our industry. The cost of producing a daily newspaper, for example, has been steadily going up for years, and that has created problems for news publications, and it sort of got to the point. Here we are in 1984. It's kind of, this is how large the audience is. That 63 million people that are reading a weekday newspaper. But then, this is 1984, and you compare that to 2020, it's down to 24 million people. And what is the difference there? The way people are consuming news is different. And because of that, many newsrooms, pardon me, have either failed to react in changing the way that they're delivering the news, moving as quickly as they can to online platforms and identifying models that are going to be able to sustain them. Then what happens is that many news outlets close down. Journalists are laid off so that the company can financially be more stable. And in the end, we have less people reading a daily newspaper than there were before. So, but newsrooms have learned to adapt. And I'm talking strictly today about podcasts, but this could also apply to video or other types of content that news outlets are putting online. But since we're talking about podcasts, these are some of the news podcasts that are out there right now, and some of them are from very in America, very recognizable names: the USA Today, the Daily, which is the New York Times, Post Reports, the Journal from the Wall Street Journal. So these are all established news outlets that have figured out a way, certainly in the podcasting space, to create content to help sustain the readership and providing content that people can consume at their leisure, but also applying the same sort of standards editorially that they've come to enjoy in the past. But there's also things like this. Start Here is ABC News. That's it's like a radio report that's actually produced as a podcast. So you can get daily bulletins every day based on the reporting that these outlets have already been doing. And I want to talk about each type in a different way. This is the this is the New York Times. Maybe they haven't quite learned everything because this is their website, and their website actually looks a lot like their print page. But the New York Times has sort of a tradition of using their front page as a way of prioritizing news for people. So people have come to experience it. But they've recreated it here online. They're still doing the same type of reporting, and yet they also, created a podcast that provides a deeper dive into the content that they're already producing. And sort of this combination of, continuing to do the type of journalism that they always have, and introducing a subscriber program, they've been able to, get 7.8 million subscribers to both print and digital. So they've been able to change in order to adapt to the changes that have occurred in our industry. Now, Vox is really kind of another interesting outlet. It may not be something that a lot of people who aren't sort of media savvy are aware of, but it does have 144 million monthly views of its content. And the reason I wanted to share this is a digital native news outlet. It was not like the New York Times or the Washington Post, where it had been established before. This came out of the changes that were occurring in journalism. It's a website and a news site that focuses on providing context to news stories. So you end up having deeper dives in such things as like healthcare, immigration, and things like that. And what they call explainer journalism, that they provide context and deeper, so you can have a deeper understanding of it. And they have a number of really strong, really good and informative podcasts that provide you with a greater analysis of what's going on. But they're digitally native. They were born on the internet, and they continue to survive on the internet, again, because they were able to identify sources of revenue that could sustain them. And then the last one I want to share with you as an example is documentedny.com. And this is a digital native website. It was, it's online. It's similar in some way to Vox. It's strictly focused on the immigrant community in New York City. And so it's sort of building on kind of the Vox model of, we're going to look at one topic very deeply. We're going to do all of our reporting, but part of their audience are the immigrant population. So they reach out to that population in many ways that other news outlets wouldn't. For example, on their top line here, they have WhatsApp. Many of the people who are their target audience use WhatsApp to communicate within their community, and that's not common necessarily for a lot of cities and news outlets across the country. So they've come up with this new model to tackle a specific issue, and what makes it different than Vox is that this is donation. This is donation funded. Rather than relying on display advertising and classified ads like the old daily newspapers did, this is been able to find a different type of funding that allows it to do the type of journalism that it's set out to do. So that's just kind of my summary. There are lots of different angles we can talk about this, but I figured that as people ask questions, we can maybe discuss a little more broadly what a lot of these changes mean to the proliferation of democracy in both our countries, but also in just better informing the populace. And that's mine.
Okay. Thank you, Michael, for enlightening us with the explanation about the changes that our media have to face related to this convergence. We will explore deeper into this trend in our Q&A session. Michael, we have participants from some universities in Indonesia here, and I'm sure they already have many things to ask you. I'd like to say hi first to our participants, students, and lecturers from Universitas Multimedia Nusantara, Universitas Indonesia, UIN Syarif Hidayatullah Jakarta, UIN Wali Songo Semarang, Universitas Muhammadiyah Malang, Universitas Al-Azhar Indonesia, Universitas Diponegoro, and Universitas Pasundan. For all of you participants, you can type your questions on the social media, Instagram, YouTube, Twitter of @America, or in this Zoom chat board. And while waiting for your question, I'd like to ask Michael a question or two. Michael, my first question is, how do the media cope with the fast-changing development of platforms outside the media? As in Indonesia, convergence tend to be seen in the perspective of combining audio, video, and text in a content. But these days, we learn that most of the media traffic comes from social media, and every month or every couple of months, we see the birth of new platforms related to news. Netflix documentary you also show in your screen before, Apple Watch, Spotify, not to mention also the rise of local platforms. And the US, which might also be a lesson for Indonesia or other countries, what is the strategy to embrace this ever-changing development of new platforms in terms of content creation and strategic partnership with the platform?
Well, that's been an ongoing struggle for many newsrooms and journalists. When I was working at a print newsroom, when the convergence began, and digital technology began changing the distribution of our stories, there was a huge push to get your stories on Facebook. We have to have our content on Facebook because that's where our audience is. And the thinking was, that's what we need to do. If people aren't coming to our website to read our stories, we need to get on Facebook, because at least we'll know our stories are being seen by people and being read. And that was a pretty good knee-jerk reaction in the beginning, but the longer this relationship between newsrooms and Facebook continued, a lot of problems emerged. Facebook was in control of the algorithm. They decided which stories had priorities and which didn't. They decided which news sites had priorities and didn't. And at the same time, where's the ad revenue? If you're not getting people onto your own website, how are you generating ad revenue? If you're just giving your content away for free to some other platform, you're not making money at home. And so that was a major hurdle that many news outlets are still trying to figure out. And then you have something like Twitter, which has larger adoption, say, in the news consumer industry than necessarily as the country abroad. That it's great for driving content to your website, but you have to change your strategy about making your content, your headlines clickable, and being able to find ways to draw people to your website. So your strategy for getting your content out there has to change. I mean, for example, I work at Patch, which is a locally focused news site, and we have a whole bunch of different strategies about how to get our content noticed in Google search and on Twitter, on social media platforms, and then creating headlines that are clickable for people that we send newsletters out to. So the digital technology has brought in all of these types of strategies and considerations that people didn't even think about before these platforms came about, and it's a constant learning process of what I need to do to report something, and then how do I find that audience? And so, I said before, this idea that old journalism was very much about broadcasting. We're going to report the news that we've collected, and we're going to tell you what news is. Because our audience has more control on when and where and how they're consuming their news, it's more important than ever for us to understand who our audience is and to listen to the type of content that they want to consume. But the problem with that is it's like, are all that they're going to want to consume, is it candy, or they have to get their vegetables in there, they have to get their good food in there somewhere, and so that's kind of the game that journalists are playing right now. We still have to cover the most important stories we can and get them to our audience, but we have to work to understand who our audience is so that we can address their concerns, but also educate them about the things that we see are important, that are going to impact their lives.
All right, thanks. We are still waiting for the question from the participants. I'm going to ask you another question. As you mentioned before about these changes, as many of the participants are students and lecturers, what do you think? How do journalism students should adapt to these changes? What needed to be adjusted in the university's curriculum? Is it the soft skill, or do they have to also learn, for instance, basic IT? What should students prepare before joining the media industry? If you can share, how do you as university cope with these changes?
It's kind of interesting because I went back to get a master's degree in digital journalism about 10 years ago for the very reason that for this question that you're asking, is coming to the realization that I didn't have the skills to do journalism the way it was changing, and so I had to pick up audio editing and video editing and how to write stories for web and strategies around social media and things like that. I think at that time there was a real concern that students coming out of journalism schools were not as prepared for maybe the skills that they needed to have, because the universities were lagging behind in what the real needs were for newsrooms. But I think it's changed a lot. And one of the things that has changed is that the students who are in school now are digital native. They've grown up with the internet their entire lives. They have, in high school, they've had their experiences with social media. They understand social media in a very different way than people who aren't, digital natives. And so, on the one hand, they have a lot of lessons, but in how to operate online and certainly how to operate on social media. So that's for example a skill you don't necessarily have to teach, but you may want to sort of enhance it with some understanding of how you use social media to push out stories. But it all comes back to what are the skills that a journalist needs to continue to be competitive and collect news and report it out. So I think while there's more of an emphasis now on the digital skills that somebody needs to have in order to produce content, produce news for news sites and in newsrooms, there's also an understanding that that the newsrooms have changed to the point where they don't need to necessarily be teaching the people who are coming in what they need to know. And so I think the gap between what was the newsroom needed and what was not being taught, I think that's closed in the last 10 years a lot. So what then needs to be taught is the basics of journalism, how to report, an understanding of what the ethics are in journalism, of being a good journalist. In the United States, we have the Society for Professional Journalists has a series of ethical rules in which the journalists apply to their work, because that's what makes us different than somebody just posting a video on TikTok or on Twitter. We employ these ethical guidelines in how we report the news, how we represent our sources, and continue to push out stories that are true and supported by facts in our reporting. and there's a whole other discussion about fake news and misinformation, and we can talk about that as well. But less the technical skills, I think, although technical skills are important, but also more the ethical considerations that go into reporting.
All right. As you have already mentioned about disinformation, we have here a question from Nadia Haryanto. She asked you about, she said, we know that the internet and social media definitely made journalists easier on doing their jobs. Yet people gets easier to share their opinion too. So what's your opinion about hoax and post-truth issues that spread lately because of the internet?
That has been something that I think a lot of people didn't quite expect. I remember there were all these stories back about the Egyptian or the Arab Spring. This idea that a protesting populace could use social media for social good, that they could communicate with each other and argue their points online, and that would be more open communication, and the idea that we could spread democracy that way. And that's a very unfortunately a kind of a naive understanding of what social media was, because it doesn't go both. It can go both ways, because if there are bad actors, if there are people who have the intention of putting out misinformation, of deceiving people for either political or monetary or whatever gains, they will do it. So then it becomes a matter of, well, how do you fight misinformation? And, a lot of journalists, their answer to that will be, well, with more good journalism. And I think that is true. We have to continue to do the good work that we're doing. But we also, and this is something that I think we've come to a greater understanding in the last few years in the United States, is we have to be able to explain why we're doing the things we do. The ethical considerations that I mentioned before, people don't, necessarily appreciate those or understand those. For example, the idea of anonymous sources, many people consider, if your story has anonymous sources, that means you're making up something, or that you're, somehow trying to deceive them by saying, oh yeah, that was anonymous sources that told me that. But journalists need to explain that, what the role of an anonymous source is. It's not somebody trying to hide the truth. It's, we keep somebody's name out of a story for a lot of really important reasons. Sometimes people are for example, if we're covering, crime, or, let's talk about that. If we're covering crime, maybe we've got an informant or a source who is at great physical risk or harm, risk for harm, because they're talking to the media. The story isn't so important to get out there that we're willing to shield that person so that they can share that information. And, as I explained this to you, and as I explained it to anybody else who's a journalist, they kind of understand that. But that's something that we don't really do a good job of doing, is explaining why we do things a certain way. Some like a politician will post something that supports whatever they particularly believe, and we may not support this story from their perspective because we see that some of it is false or it can't be confirmed. And so then people come at the journalist and saying, "Oh, you're just being oppositional. You're not reporting what this person said." Well, we may discover that what that person has said is false, and then what we'll do is we'll report that. We'll say, we have these other sources that say that this is not how this politician or some other bad actor has presented something, but then it looks like the press is being adversarial, or the press is taking a political position, when really what we're trying to do is provide context and an understanding of the true nature. Unfortunately, a lot of people think when you cover a political story that there are two sides to a story and that both sides is equal. And I think in an older America where you would think that you've got two competing different political views, and so yes, you need to report both sides. But if one side is involved in spreading disinformation, or the information that they're sharing is not truthful, or can't be supported by facts, then we need to report that. But the perception then becomes that we're siding, that we're not giving the other side, which is presenting a false narrative, we're not giving them the same weight as the other. Well, we wouldn't. I mean, if one group says the sun comes up in the morning, and the other group says the sun comes up at night, we're going to report the sun comes up in the morning because that's the facts that we can of the situation. We're not going to say, well, but this other person says that the sun comes up at night, so you get to make a decision. Well, that's not what reporting is. That's not what the job of a journalist is.
Right. We also have a question related to citizen journalism here from Teddy Rahmansyah. He asked, how do news in America get the news? Do you only rely on journalists or also provide opportunities for the public to contribute in providing news? Because as we know, people tend to be closer and understand an event that is happening around them.
And this goes back to what I was saying before. There's nothing wrong. I'm not saying that people who are on the ground, who are at an event or witness something, that they shouldn't post something on social media, or they shouldn't post a video or something like that. The press operates independently of that. Anyone can post their opinion and put their stuff up there. The press, though, what we try to do is present ourselves as a source that you can trust, because we apply our journalistic ethics to the work that we do. And sometimes, like, I remember there was like a shooting years ago in New York City, and there were people who were at the scene of the crime who were posting like photos of blood on the sidewalk. And they can do that because that the platform allowed them to do that, and they were witnesses certainly to that. But a newsroom wouldn't necessarily do that. Probably wouldn't do that, because it really comes down to, well, that's just a sensational thing that doesn't really tell the story of what's actually going on. So the public, there are certainly stories and things that have come out. You can look at many of the Black Lives Matter stories that have come out over the last couple of years. The stories about police inappropriate use of police force, and many of those stories, and the story, many of those stories are supported by video that has been uploaded and taken by amateurs. That doesn't mean they're not, that doesn't make them journalists by posting them online. That just makes them sort of a source for content. It's the journalist's role to view that content and decide, okay, what is this? Can we confirm that this actually happened? And if we do, are we going to include it? Are we going to get the proper permission to use it with our story? And what other context that can we use this in? I mean, maybe yes, the video as it's presented shows the actual thing that's happening, but maybe the person who's posted it has put on only a few seconds of it, or has cut out something that's much more enlightening as to what the actual story is. So this then becomes a problem for the consumer, because they're like, well, where do I go to get what the real story is? And, again, that's what we as journalists try to do. We try to be the arbiters of, okay, what is the truth here? What is it that we can support with the facts that we're able to gather? And what is the context that we can put this on? And that way, in the eyes of the consumer, then we're a more trusted source than somebody we don't know who just posts something. Again, that doesn't mean what they're posting isn't true. It just means that our role in this is verifying that truth and saying to the audience, that video that guy posted, yes, that's what that means, and here's the other reporting around it, and what you need to know about the larger story.
who says here that oh, people here in Indonesia tend to go for free information. Uh, is that also happen in the US? We know how Convergence affect newspaper, but how does it affect radio and TV in the US?
It's interesting because it's impacted the different news platforms, differently over the years. Obviously, print took the first hit because a lot of they lost a lot of their display advertising because all of that advertising started to move over to the online environment, and so they were struggling. Many news outlets were struggling to find ways to support themselves. And so, it was important for many newsrooms like that to try to figure out a way to get their content online because that's where the audience was. And so they were sort of chasing it. At the same time, they were struggling to come up with revenue streams that would allow them to sustain. And there are other factors in this. There's the factor of the way, the dip in the economy in 2008 and 2009, that sort of sped things up. And then you also have where large corporations are buying up smaller newspapers and sort of burning through them and closing them. So you end up having these things called news deserts, where you have large sections of the country that aren't getting the news. So a lot of different factors at play here. It's not all just digital technology. A lot of it is finance and sustainability. And yes, people want free news, but free news doesn't necessarily mean that it's reported news. That just be able, the digital technology, which I haven't really kind of addressed, has given people the ability to produce content, produce videos, and post stories online and on social media. It's given greater access to the consumer to create content that may be free. But we're even seeing now, for example, YouTube is, there are ads that are being sold on that are helping to support YouTube, but also helping to a degree to support the people who are creating this content. So what I would say to anybody who is like, yeah, well, I'm not going to pay for that. Well, what you're going to get at the end is you're not going to be supporting newsrooms. You're not going to be supporting journalists. And then you're going to have content that comes online that will not be verified, that will not be reported, and it creates a situation where it's easier for people with a particular political perspective or for whatever reasons are trying to send out deceptive information. So, in radio, for example, radio is going through a lot of the same things because radio, the audience for radio has really been shrinking over the last decade, and part of that is because many of the people who listen to audio content are baby boomers, and as the baby boomers get older, and as advertisers are looking for younger audiences, they're going less to the radio platform, and the baby boomers become less of a target for their advertising and for the content that they're creating. So, that will continue. Audio will continue for a while. There still are people who are going for audio, but it is a much smaller audience. And radio in the United States that has existed all along through grants and sponsorships and through donations. So that content is still available and will probably sustain for much longer than a commercial radio station. But, and we're seeing disruption in, network television with the ability, with DVRs, with the ability to, on the one hand, record and view the content later on. But now you have, with Netflix, you have the ability to watch an entire series in one night. And so streaming of content, again, this goes into who's controlling it. It used to be that if there was a TV show that you liked, it was every Sunday night at 6 p.m. That's when you would watch it. But now you can watch it whenever you want, or you cannot watch it. It's because you're not only is it that there's content that's available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's lots more content on lots of different platforms. So if you look at successful programs that are doing well on Netflix, they may have millions of an audience that is millions of people, but that's much smaller than the audiences in the United States than when we had 3 or 4 broadcast outlets, where you would see tens of millions of people watching a program, whereas now the top program may be just 6 or 7 million. So digital media streaming, not only of audio and podcasts, has affected radio, but video has also affected how people consume television programs, and you see that and how that's disrupted. And we've even seen how it's disrupted movies, aided by everybody being stuck at home because of COVID. The dependence on I'd rather see this movie, be able to see it, stream it online today, than have to go down and support a movie house. So that's even another way that digital technology has disrupted another industry, the filmmaking industry. So this disruption is across the entire media landscape, and it has hit each place at a different point, and the people who are able to adapt to it and identify ways to reach audiences and get revenue, generate revenue, they're the ones that are going to be able to succeed. The ones who are at the front of this push and who can adapt quickly to the change. I feel like I'm giving these really long answers.
As in Indonesia, where audience prefer free content, I can relate to the question before. Do you have suggestion for media, like what kind of business model that might work in this situation?
I was just talking. I interviewed somebody yesterday for a podcast that we're going to post in a month or so, and she started a company in northern Kentucky, which is one of our states, where the daily newspaper had disappeared like 15 years ago. And so, the populace didn't have a place where they could get their local news. So this new company started, and it's not a nonprofit. They're out there to make money, but they're making money through a variety of different ways. They're not only are they going to be an online site, they're going to be, they're publishing a biweekly newspaper that's going to have, deep content, longer stories and other things that are based on the reporting they're doing. But they're going to be digital first. If they cover a news story, it's going to be online. People are going to be able to get it. But they're generating revenue through a combination of subscriptions, both to the print and to the online outlet, through advertising, both online and in print, and donations and grants. And the donations and grants are going to be they're going to be limited to particular types of stories, for public service type stories. Looking at healthcare or looking at voter fraud or things like that. You're not going to be able to use it to cover what's the new TV program or what's the high school sports or something. It's going to be dedicated to journalism that's going to enlighten the audience. So there's not one answer for revenue support for news outlets in most cases. Another thing that many people that we've spoken to on our podcast is that they're going into the event space, where they'll have an event, they'll have an author, or they'll have an expert, and I talked to some people at the Los Angeles Times that they've built this very robust online streaming content that they were creating throughout COVID, which they were able to support through sponsorships and advertising. It was a boon. It succeeded very well. And it was the model that they kind of had before, but it wasn't until COVID came about, when people were hungry for that type of content. But they couldn't go to a bookstore to listen to an author speak, but they could, sign up to this particular event, maybe pay a fee to go view a conversation between a famous author. And, they built something that was sustainable. So the advice I would give to any newsroom is, figure out who your audience is. I mean, that's the advice for everything. Who is your audience? What problems can you solve for them? And what revenue models do you think will be the best to support what you're doing? Do you put up a paywall and charge subscriptions? Do you, pursue grants from, foundations and things like that? Be creative, be entrepreneurial. If you've never done an event before, maybe events is a way to come up with something, creating a type of content, that is appealing to your audience, but also represents your mission of bringing useful information to people that they want to receive in a format that they enjoy, receiving that information in.
Okay. We also have question here about skills, probably repeating to what have been asked before. It's from Aziz Purmala. He asked, what skills do journalists have to have in order to adapt with or survive media convergence?
Okay. One thing that's been clear throughout this disruption and this evolution that's going on in journalism is that journalists need to have more technical skills than they ever had before. And that means that sometimes they're going to be shooting video, they're going to be taking photos, they're going to be recording interviews, they're going to have to do maybe live shots where, like with Periscope or Facebook Live, they may be at an event and they're going to have to, be able to, present their story live. And then they still have to write content for the website. So a journalist's job is a lot broader and requires a lot more skills than it has in the past. You're going to have to be comfortable being in front of the camera. You're going to have to be comfortable interviewing people and learning how to shoot video and edit video. And it may be part of your job that you're going to have to learn how to handle data sets. Maybe you get a big file from the city government that has taxes, tax information or information about school populations, and you're going to have to figure out a way to pull information out of that to not only help your reporting, but also maybe to create charts and other graphics to present that information. That may be part of your job. That may be your job. So, obviously, any of the multimedia skills you're going to need to learn. You're going to need to have an understanding of social media and how, how you can use it to not only promote your content, send out links and engage conversations with people who are your sources online, but also, how to listen to your audience. And incorporate that conversation in the work that you're doing, because if you don't, if you close the door on your audience, they're going to let you know that they're not interested in what you have to say. If you're trying to assume the role of being a broadcaster of the news rather than someone who listens and who shares, then people react to that. Because again, the people who are coming up today are digital native, and they've come to they're very comfortable in expressing their opinion online and letting people know that who aren't listening to them, that they're not going to support them, and they may actually start actively trolling you for not either listening to them or not reporting the larger story. So getting comfortable in that space, that's really kind of important for being a journalist as well. Understanding that you're going to you're going to run up against people who are going to criticize you, and so you need to develop a thick skin as well. And the other thing I would say is, think also about your writing. I mean, it is our core skill. Many journalists, most of what they do is reporting and writing. So be a good reporter, be a good listener to what people and your sources say, but also learn how to communicate effectively with writing skills. And then also the last skill is to familiarize yourself with the ethical guidelines that guide journalists and why they're important and why you need to incorporate them into your work. So those are all the skills, both soft and hard skills.
Okay, that's like a lot. Oh, do you think journalists are happier with the situation, with these changes, or do you think they consider it as a burden, additional work to handle?
I don't know a journalist who doesn't like complaining about things. But we're all kind of facing this situation. There are things that we're going to be asked to do that we weren't trained to do, that we're going to have to learn how to do, because so many journalists have been laid off and there's so fewer outlets to work at. There are lots of people who are interested in the job you're doing and will do it if you don't adapt. At the same time, something else that's going on right now in America is, and this is happening for all, it's not just journalists, but for everybody who's a worker and who goes to an office, this idea that, through COVID, we began to understand that we could do our jobs differently. And, a lot of journalists have already been doing this. They don't go into the office. They spend their day out in the field. They sit down at a coffee shop and they get their laptop out. They write their story and they post it from there. But that's going to happen more. And so it's become a bigger discussion point lately about quality of life issues. I mean, it used to be with journalism, you had a set deadline and that you spent as long as you needed to get your stuff in by that deadline. 24-hour news cycle, your deadline's all over the place. It could be the first thing in the morning, in the middle of the day, it could be in the middle of the night. So you could end up working a 14, 17, 18-hour day every day. But I think people are becoming to understand that they need to have a better quality of life in journalism. And a lot, many newsrooms are starting to unionize. They're asking their employers to come up with systems that they can continue to do their journalism, but also have a life outside of journalism. Not just because it's a good practice, but for mental health and stress reasons. These are very stressful jobs. So I think that's a conversation that's happening more. People wanting to, everybody wants to be a journalist because of the important things that we're doing, the importance of the job we do for democracy, but we also, for our own selves, for our own mental and physical health, we need to be able to disconnect and have lives outside of journalism. And digital technology makes that of it happen. We don't have to go to work. We can, write and report things quicker than we have in the past and create content, different types of content quickly and post them online, and even like interview and reach different types of sources because we have digital technology. So the skills that are making our job harder are also the skills that can actually help us make our lives better. So it's like everything with digital journalism, it's always a balance. It's not all one thing. You can very easily, your life can be overwhelmed by the work you're doing, but greater awareness of your mental health and your own general health, of being able to disconnect and have a real life outside of journalism is becoming more important, I think. I don't know if that answered your question, but that was where I was going.
All right. We have other questions here.
Sure.
From Fajar Nugraha. Has the social media disrupt online media sustainability in the U.S.?
Could you repeat that again, please?
He asked whether the social media disrupt online media sustainability in the U.S.
Yeah. Oh, can online? I want to make sure I understand. Is social media disrupting online media in the U.S.? Is that what the question was?
The online media, whether online media can sustain or not because of this social media.
I don't necessarily think that those two are connected, or one
Right.
is undermining the other. I think social media is part of our environment that we need to operate under, and we use social media as part of our job to gather information and to disseminate our stories and things like that. So for us, it's a tool, but I wouldn't say necessarily social media is competitive for us in the sense that we're going to lose revenue. However, it can contribute. Social media can contribute to a lot of things. There was this story that the New York Times did about a year ago. This is before Facebook changed its algorithms. This was after the 2016 election, and before there was this. Before Facebook changed its monetization algorithm, there were people who were actually writing posts on Facebook that were just strictly sensational because the platform had set it up so that they monetized. You made more money the more clicks you got on your headlines, and so you had people who were creating these blogs that had no reporting in them that purported to be news sites, and their business model was to write the most sensational headlines that they could because they would be rewarded for that by Facebook's financial advertising model. And after the 2016 election, when a lot of people were criticizing the platforms for not cracking down on fake news and false headlines, Facebook went back in and they changed everything. And so this New York Times story where they interviewed this couple who were in Ohio, they were not journalists. They were not following any journalistic guidelines. All they cared about was, okay, people are going to click on this headline because it's the craziest headline. They're going to want to click on it. And so they had no ethical boundaries to what they were doing. And it's sort of like a horror story in the digital journalism space because, these tools that we use are as well as being good ways to send out the truth and engage your audience and distribute news stories, can also be used by unethical people to push out false information and sensational headlines without any consideration ethically about what they're doing, because all it is money. So it was a system that was rewarding negative behavior, and it was very impactful on the 2016 election, and it was something in the subsequent elections that people were paying more attention to, that this was something that needed to be addressed. And what ends up happening is you have this sort of combat between people who want to click on and read stories that support their particular political event, perspective, or are critical of the other political perspective out there, and that's part of one of the negative things that's in our environment. I don't necessarily think, back to the question, that social media is negatively impacting our revenue. I do think it's making it harder for journalists because we have to be able to show an audience that we're reporting the news in an unbiased and in an ethical way. And so this sort of spread of all types of headlines and all types of content online, it kind of muddies the water. So maybe in that environment, it creates problems for journalists in that newsrooms have to figure out a way to continually be responsible and do responsible journalism, and yet exist in an environment where bad actors, where people pushing out false information are able to continue to do that and be supported through that through various types of revenue things. So that's how I would answer that question.
Okay. This might not be related to convergence, but this is an interesting question from Gloria Gusiningsi. She asked, do you think the digital technology will make journalist profession less needed as there are Internet of Things such as artificial intelligence system that probably in the future will create the news by itself?
Oh, you mean like AI writing stories?
Robot journalism.
Yeah, I haven't thought deeply about this question. I would hope that there would be journalists, the need for journalists, as long as we need and have a democracy, and there is a need to for people to be there to report news fairly and ethically. That being said, there's so much in our lives that have changed that 10 years ago I wouldn't have thought of a lot, handing things over to an artificial intelligence or an algorithm to do things. And one can envision a time when maybe that would be a scenario. I mean, there are programs that are being used to generate news stories. I know that I think AP was experimenting. The Associated Press was, part of what they do is they're sending college sports scores and things like that around the country. And these were people want to get the college sports scores. They want to find out who, scored the most baskets in a basketball game or the most goals in a football game. And so they had this, artificial intelligence journalist, for lack of a better, creating these stories that were very, just basic information. And it was a way, on one hand, it was a way to free up the journalists from having to, write these rather kind of boring, flat stories. But yet that it opens the door for other types of content being created that way. So, I mean, yeah, I could envision very easily in, 10 or 20 years, maybe even sooner, because everything seems to come sooner, where we have more stories that are generated. But then it becomes, well, who writes the program? Who is who's the outlet or the source that is allowing this to happen, and for what reasons? As I said, the scenario I mentioned before about the Facebook algorithm, that people were sending out false information and sensational headlines. Everything in journalism at the end of the day comes down to money. Sadly, can a news outlet continue by creating a revenue stream to support it? If somebody starts an artificial intelligence journalist to put out a certain type of story and figures out how to make money off of it, then yeah, I could see that happening. So then it becomes, well, what is the ethical constraints to that individual who is doing that? So then it becomes a world without journalists. And I don't want to sound so much like a cheerleader, but we represent a part of our society that is committed to reporting the truth. And provided we have an AI that can do something like that without being affected by the other forces of commerce, of trying to make money off of false information, then maybe an AI would replace journalists, and maybe that would be good. But it probably, like everything else we have found out about digital technology, it's both good and bad. It creates some wonderful things, but it also creates things that we never imagined, negative things that we never imagined.
Okay, Michael, the next question addressed to you comes from Trinsa Dantiani. It's about the length of the content. She said that I've been reading reports that there's a growing demand for slow, long-form journalism. Do you think this is true, or is it the opposite? Because people tend to want their news in bite-sized posts that they can scroll through on their social media feed.
That's a good question, and it addresses several things that are going on in newsrooms right now. You may go cover a city council meeting, and you may live tweet it. Hear the basic information that I'm observing as it is happening, and that's one way that you're feeding that audience who likes to get their news in small bites in Twitter. And you take your notes and you go back to your newsroom, and maybe you write your news story, and that's longer, and it has other sources, and it links to other stories. And so you started at the beginning by taking advantage of social media, creating blurbs of content that you're able to send out quickly. And then you go back and you create a longer story that gives more context so that people who like to read a little longer story can see that on the website. And then you may turn around and maybe like at the New York Times, we have something like the Daily, which is a daily deep dive into a particular subject as a podcast. Maybe you're going to go and sit in and be interviewed on the Daily. So you're going to talk about the meeting you covered and the different aspects of the story, and the host is going to ask you questions. So from one meeting, you've created several different layers of content to be consumed in different ways. And as far as long form versus immediate, again, it goes back to what I was saying about control. And the platform. It's digital technology has allowed the consumer to get the news in any way that they prefer whenever they want to get it. And so if they, as more and more people you rely on their cell phone for the news, they're going to have a print aspect to what they do, and that's going to be serving an audience who still wants to read, longer news pieces about the stories that they're concerned about. So the days of a journalist covering a meeting, going back to the office, making a few phone calls, and writing one long piece of story that goes into a printed edition the next day. Most of that has sort of shifted away. And obviously there's still daily newspapers that do that kind of reporting. But you may be writing several versions of that story in a day on different types of platforms. And there may be updates. You cover a meeting at 9 a.m., and then at 5 p.m., the person at the meeting resigns for something that happened at the meeting. So you're updating the story that's already live. You're tweeting it out to let people know that it's happening. So news stories now function on so many different platforms that it's great from a consumer's perspective, but from a journalist's perspective, this is one of the new realities that we have to deal with, that our jobs are much more complicated. And the thing is, content that you write for Twitter is different than content that you're going to write online, even if it's about the same subject, because people are consuming it differently. And it requires different strategies. You have to think about the content of your tweet, because it's a limited amount of space. What can I put on here that's going to give people the information, that's going to make people want to follow me, and then maybe even click through to the story that I'm going to write later in the day? So you're not only writing the same story on different platforms, you're thinking about how each version you're doing is going to take advantage of the strengths of each platform. And again, if you're doing it on a website or a tablet, maybe that means that you need to create a video that goes with it. So it's not just one thing anymore. A journalist has to have a ton of different skills, and they have to be able to apply them wherever they are, whatever particular space they're at. And that's the new reality of what it is to be a journalist now.
Oh, right. Moving from the journalist side, there's Michelle Aura from Universitas Indonesia asking about the audience trust in media. She said that she heard somewhere that Americans don't really believe the news shared on social media. And if that is true, she wants to know why that happened. She also asked whether there's differences between content shared on social media and probably on the media itself.
I think, and this has been kind of a hard lesson that America is learning, and it's all a matter of where we are in understanding and recognizing that this is a problem. Again, all of these great things that we're able to do now on technology have also made it easier for people who want to push out false information for lots of different reasons, or who want to criticize journalists and marginalize them, call them fake news or whatever. The same tools we're using to report the news, people are using against us, and they are using against the truth. And digital technology has sort of risen up without any massive effort to inform people about how to use it and how to be skeptical about the things that you are reading online. And that was one of the big lessons that came out of the 2016 election in the United States, when there was no real control or interest by the platforms in controlling the content that was pushed out. They were more interested in pushing out the content that was false, because that was more click-worthy. And so a lot of people have been burned by that. They'll discover that, oh, this thing that I believed, it turns out I was wrong. But then you get into very dangerous situations in America where, a good chunk of our society just doesn't believe journalists, who think that journalists are actively engaged in trying to misinform them. And so you have this political social divide that's going on right now. And at the same time, the people who do believe journalists, they may be guilty of the same sort of behavior online as people who don't believe in journalists. They're gonna click on the type of content that they believe, that supports what they believe. And so again, this creates an environment where, it draws into question if anything online is true. And so part of this, part of the solution is that yes, journalists need to continue reporting the news. We need to fact check the stories we're writing. We need to fact check what newsmakers, what lawmakers, and politicians are saying and doing. All those things that are part of our job. But we also need to be transparent about who we are and what we're doing and why we are doing it. That we're not doing it for a political reason. We're doing it because we honestly believe that reporting the truth is going to benefit our society and is going to help democracy thrive. But at the same time, other people are working against us and sending out disinformation. So digital technology has consumed our industry and has become integral to what we do, to the point, without any social preparation. The society has not been prepared for this type of delivery system. And some people learn that, they get burned by something, and then they learn, oh, well, I shouldn't have trusted that. Or, oh, yeah, it turns out that person was lying. But many people haven't learned that lesson yet. And I think we're unfortunately in a situation where many people still believe everything that they see online, and they don't necessarily understand how sharing something that's false helps to spread disinformation, and what the negative impact of that is. So in America, we haven't quite figured out how that is. And one solution that I've heard people talk about, and that I've heard educators talk about, is a concerted effort for media literacy, where from a very young age you begin teaching in schools how to consume media digitally, and understand, what to look for in headlines and in news stories that may clue you into something being false. And that's a type of learning that just needs to happen at some point. But journalists' role in this, again, is to be transparent, is so that people understand what we're doing and why we do things a certain way and what the benefits of it are. And right now, a lot of journalists are really kind of bad at doing that. Bad about, I'm just reporting the news. You just believe what I say. Well, we need to know the process that you use. We need to know who you've talked to and why you've written the story the way you have. Because the more transparent you are, the more people will begin to understand that you may be the trusted source in this dialogue, and it is more likely for people in the future to believe what you're doing. If you hide behind this idea that we're just this organization that's out there that's just pushing this stuff out with no consideration to what the audience thinks, then it's going to give this perception that we may be bad actors too. We may be sending out disinformation. So again, we need to be transparent. We need to be upfront about who we are and why we're doing it, so that to help people understand that they can trust us, and we have to do the work, do the ethical and reporting considerations, so they can trust us.
Okay. We have one last question. Actually, we have lots of questions here, but our time is limited. This is our final question. Will be from Veronica Young. She asked whether you think that the journalism code of conduct now already in accordance with this digital era. What kind of ethic do you think should be added probably into the code of conduct and journalists should have nowadays?
I think the basic journalism ethics that have been laid out by the Society of Professional Journalism, which is you represent all sides fairly, you name your sources, all the things that are there, I think still apply. But I think what has worked against journalists in the last 10 years is a misunderstanding. Again, this goes to media literacy, understanding what we're doing. The misunderstanding of fairness and balance. This idea that two different sources say opposite things, that we must represent both of them because that would be fair and balanced. But in actuality, like I said before, if one says the sun comes up in the morning and the other says the sun comes up at night, we're going to choose the one that comes up in the morning, and then we're going to be open to criticism. Well, you're not, that other one is just as equally important. Well, no, it isn't, because that's not what the facts are. And so, again, we need to be transparent. We need people to understand that we're writing news, reporting news based on facts, and that we're not just including other information for this idea of false balance, that they're somehow equal. No, we're going to give more weight to something that's factually correct. And that's something I think that needs to be more clearly understood in the way we report our news, but also in the way people consume news, as to why we report a particular way. So.
Okay, we have a concluding question here that will end our discussion. Michael, what do you think the future of traditional media in the United States?
Traditional media. I think the media that we have is going to continue down the road that we've sort of laid out here. I think we're going to see more large news outlets, especially the ones who do not learn how to adapt and identify revenue streams to support them, will disappear. I think we can expect more of the same for the next 5 to 10 years. Places are going to close down. New digital startups will come up like Vox to replace others, to provide the content. People still want news. People still want news they trust. And so there will always be a need for that. It's just, how is it going to live? How is it going to survive and sustain so that, it can provide that information?
Okay. Thanks, Michael. I hate to bring the curtain down, especially to such an interesting discussion and left many questions unanswered. But it's getting late here. And before I return the stage back to the organizer of the event, I'd like to say once again, thank you, Michael, for sharing your thoughts with us today. Also, thank you at America and US Embassy for conducting this event. We hope there will be more events like this in the future. And thank you to all of the participants who are willing to stay late for this discussion. Let's give a round of applause to Michael by clicking on the applause button on our Zoom and press like on at America YouTube channel. Once again, thank you for joining us. I hope to see you again in other event. Good evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much to our speaker, Michael, along with our moderator, Dr. Camelia, for today's very informative session. Earlier in the event, we asked audience members a question. That question is, how many awards in journalism were specified in Joseph Pulitzer's will? And the correct answer to that is 4. The first Pulitzer Prizes were awarded in 1917 under the supervision of the advisory board entrusted by Joseph Pulitzer. Shout out goes to Mila Nur Fatika from Zoom for answering correctly. And thank you to everyone who has participated. Don't forget to tune in next time for another chance to get a shout out from us. Now, you may be wondering, how could I develop an awesome idea for a place like this? It's very easy. All you need to do is go to our website at www.atamerica.or.id, select Create a Program, and click Collaborate with us. All event proposals coming to us will be reviewed, and your event might be featured here soon. You can also subscribe to our newsletter for all our weekly updates. And that's it. That wraps this episode. It's been fun, but we have to say goodbye for now. Follow our Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at @ATAmerica for our fun contents, event updates, and so much more. Thank you again, everyone, for joining. My name is James, and we'll see you at the next At America TV episode. Goodbye.